Module 24. Now, let's talk about your cerebrum. The cerebrum is referred to as your seat of intelligence, meaning you're going to perform here all of the functions that are associated with consciousness. So these are things that you're aware of. The areas of the brain that we've already discussed carry on those subconscious functions that you are not aware of. So for example, this is the area that gives you sensory perception. Now when you hear the word perception, perception means conscious awareness. So these are sensations that we know are happening to and within our body. This is also where you're going to have a lot of memory storage, you're going to have higher thought, your judgment, and it's where you have the ability to initiate voluntary motor actions, things that you intend to do. Now, with regards to the anatomy of the cerebrum, as mentioned in our first module, the cerebrum is divided into a right and left cerebral hemisphere. They are divided into the right and left cerebral hemisphere by the longitudinal cerebral fissure. The cerebrum is also separated from the more inferior cerebellum by the transverse cerebral fissure. Now, you're going to hear me refer to the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is the superficial gray matter. So when you look at a model or you look at your sheet brain, you are looking at cerebral cortex. Now, your cerebral cortex is divided into 5 lobes. 4 lobes are nicely named after the bones that they are deep to. So your frontal lobe is deep to the frontal bone. The parietal lobe is deep to the parietal bone. The occipital lobe is deep to the occipital bone. And the temporal lobe is deep to the temporal lobe bone. However, there is a 5th lobe called the insula. Now, its functions are less understood because of its position. This lobe, as you can see in the figure, is the little teeny orange lobe. It's deep to the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes. So think of the insula as being insulated by the lobes that are on the surface. Now, with regards to the different lobes, there are 2 sulci that help to separate the lobes that you need to be aware of. The first is called the central sulcus. The central sulcus is the sulcus that divides the frontal lobe from your parietal lobe. The lateral sulcus is going to separate your temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobes. Now, before going further, there are 3 things that you have to keep in mind as we talk about your cerebrum. 1, you have to remember that each hemisphere receives sensory information from opposite sides of the body. So remember, sensations coming from the right side of the body, the somatic sensations, are going to the left cerebral cortex, and the somatic sensations from the left side of the body are going to the right cerebral cortex. You also have to remember that the motor commands leaving your cerebral cortex are heading to the opposite side of the body. So commands made by the right cerebral cortex are controlling primarily the left side of the body, and the skeletal muscle motor commands made by the left cerebral cortex are controlling the skeletal muscles on the right side of the body. You also have to remember that each hemisphere does perform some slightly different functions. The right side has its gifts and the left hemisphere has its gifts, and that they have these differences in function despite having similar structure. Also, when we start talking about functional regions in the cerebrum, you have to remember that region and function is not really precise. We are going to be referring to your functional regions as an on average, where on average this region's located here, and on average this second location is here. But know that these regions can be smaller or larger from person to person, and that some of the regions do overlap, so that you could have a patch of cerebral cortex that actually functions in two different regions. So we're learning a lot of average location, average function, but know that there is variability. Now, for the cerebral cortex, for all of that gray matter to do what it does, it has to be extensively networked. So we need to talk a little bit about the cerebral white matter, which is where you have all of those axons carrying information from area to area. Now, if you start thinking about networking, there are going to be different levels of communication that your cerebrum is going to need to be able to do. If you are within one hemisphere, it might become necessary for the parietal lobe of the right hemisphere to talk to the frontal lobe of the right hemisphere, or just to be able to talk from gyrus to gyrus, from fold to fold, within a single lobe. So if you're going to be talking within one single hemisphere, you're going to network through what are called association fibers. Association fibers connect different regions within the same cerebral hemisphere. So we need to network each hemisphere so it can talk to itself. It then might become necessary for you to be able to communicate from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere, because each hemisphere does have some slightly different function. So you might need to send information from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere because the function you need is on the left, not on the right. Now, if you're going to be talking between hemispheres, we're going to need to use what are called commissural fibers. Commissural fibers are going to allow right and left hemispheres to communicate with each other. Now, the largest bundle of commissural fibers is actually found in a structure called the corpus callosum. So this is in yellow in the lower image on the screen. It's a huge tract of commissural fibers connecting your right and left hemispheres. So between the association fibers and the commissural fibers, the entire cerebrum is networked. However, your cerebrum, your conscious self, is going to have to be able to communicate with the lower brain areas in order to receive sensory information and to get those motor commands out and out to the body. So you need a third set of cables to communicate this kind of information. So we're going to be using what are called projection fibers. Projection fibers extend between the cerebrum and lower brain areas. For example, do you remember way back in the medulla oblongata, I mentioned the pyramids, and that in the pyramids you have corticospinal tracts. These tracts contain axons coming from the cerebral cortex, heading through the brain down into the spinal cord. They're a perfect example of projection fibers. Now, I have mentioned the limbic system. The limbic system is your emotional brain. So the structures involved in the limbic system are going to help create the full range of human emotion. It's also referred to as your motivational system. Motivation means that you have a desire to carry out a command. So the motivational system is going to make you want to carry out the commands being created by the cerebral cortex. So imagine you're comfortable on your couch, your remote batteries have gone out, and you have a show you want to watch, but you're on the wrong channel. and you're laying on the couch, and don't you start mulling it over in your head. You're all comfortable. You're nice and relaxed. Is it worth getting up? So your cerebral cortex has created the command. It has created all the movements you have to make to go over to your TV, find the actual buttons that can change the channels, and change the channel to get to the show you want. But don't you have to have the desire to move? So your limbic system is going to create that desire to get you off that couch. However, if your motivation is not strong enough, won't you just lay there and stare at whatever comes on next? Now, your limbic system, as this emotional brain and as this motivational system, does have some important roles. With regards to its role in emotion, it does have two different types of centers. One center is called a gratification center. Gratification centers create a sense of pleasure or reward. So if what is happening is pleasurable, these centers are going to help you feel that pleasure and reward those positive emotions. You do also have aversion centers, and these produce unpleasant sensations such as fear or sorrow. So you do have different centers that can create the positive or the negative emotional states. These structures are also all used in the storage and recollection of memories. Now, there are several different components to the limbic system. There is a structure called the cingulate gyrus. The cingulate gyrus extends over the top of the corpus callosum in both the frontal and parietal lobes. The hippocampus is another structure. It's located in the medial temporal lobe. The amygdala, which is anterior to the hippocampus in the temporal lobe, plus a variety of other brain areas. I've already mentioned the mammillary bodies, your hypothalamus. Also, when we talk about the cerebral cortex, there's an area called your prefrontal area, which you will hear about in our next module. There's the orbitofrontal cortex. Even your basal nuclei, your cerebellum, and some of your thalamic nuclei all play a role in the limbic system, whether it's just transmitting information, storing memory, or actually part of the processing and the creation of the sensations. Now I want to take a moment and I want to talk about those basal nuclei that have been mentioned previously. The basal nuclei are masses of gray matter embedded in your cerebral white matter, and they primarily function to determine the onset and cessation of your intentional movements. So they're going to help you start and stop movements that you intend to do. They also assist with your highly practiced learned behaviors. So things that you have learned to do that now you don't even think about when you actually perform the activity, like writing. And when you learned to write, wasn't it very, you had to really concentrate to make the C's and the L's and connect them. But when you go to write now, you don't even think. You can just write the letters down on the paper. Driving. You had to take all that time to learn to drive, but now that you know how, your body just knows how to coordinate moving your foot from gas to brake, turning on and off your turn signals and so forth. Even tying your shoes is something that you learn to do. Your basal nuclei also help to regulate those repetitive hip and shoulder movements during walking and running. Now, the basal nuclei, remember, are linked to the substantia nigra, also some of your subthalamic nuclei. And I just wanted to remind you that it's the dopamine from the substantia nigra that is going to regulate the function of these nuclei. and that the loss of the substantia nigra, the loss of that dopamine, causes a severe disruption in the coordination in these nuclei, and that disruption causes the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. All right, now for the fun. Let's talk about your cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is all gray matter, so you have your nerve cell bodies, your terminal arborizations, you've got your dendrites in here, you've got unmyelinated axons, so you've got a huge communication area. Now, the cerebral cortex is 40% of your brain mass, and it does carry on the basic functions involved in consciousness. Now, the actual functional areas of the cerebral cortex can be broken down into 4 general types of areas. We have sensory areas, which give you a conscious awareness of sensory information. So you know you've seen something, heard something, smelled something, tasted something, felt something touch your skin, but there's no understanding. So these sensory areas give you awareness, they give you perception without any comprehension of it. So think of them as just crude, I felt it. With regards to the motor areas, these areas control voluntary movement. So these areas are going to create the commands that are going to cause contraction in your skeletal muscles. Association areas are a little bit more complex. Association areas have the ability to interpret incoming data. So they actually can take the information from your sensory area and put meaning to it. They can tell you what the sensation meant. They also have the ability to coordinate motor responses. So they can create a very complex plan, send that plan to the motor areas, and then the motor area sends the signals to the muscles that are involved. The highest level of processing, though, are from your integrative areas. Integrative areas receive information from many different association areas, so they can give you more of a bigger picture. They can tie together the hearing, the vision, the taste, and the smell and give you a kind of a whole body perspective. And they have the ability to direct extremely complex motor activities. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to go from the ground up. We're going to start with the sensory areas and the motor areas, where the functions are a little bit more straightforward, and then we'll build into those more complex associative and integrative areas. So let's talk about your sensory areas. The first one I want to mention is your primary somatosensory cortex. Now, do you remember when I talked about the central sulcus? And I said the central sulcus is located as the boundary between frontal and parietal lobes. That sulcus is very important because anterior to that sulcus is a very special fold called the precentral gyrus. Posterior to that sulcus is a really important fold called the postcentral gyrus. And when you're trying to find your primary somatosensory cortex, it is located in the entire postcentral gyrus of your parietal lobe. Now, your primary somatosensory cortex has 2 really interesting functions. One is it gives you perception of your somatic senses. Now, the somatic senses are usually referred to as your general senses because the general senses can be found across the entire body because your skin is detecting these sensations across your entire surface. So your somatic senses would include touch, pressure, pain, itch, tickle, vibration, even stretch and movement. Now, in addition to becoming consciously aware of these somatic senses, you also gain the ability to identify where the sensation came from, meaning you have what is called spatial discrimination. You know where it came from on your body. Now, the reason you have spatial discrimination is that on this post-central gyrus, you have what is called a somatosensory homunculus. I know, weird sounding word, huh? Well, the homunculus is actually a really, really old name. Way back when, before they knew everything they know now about the reproductive system, it was believed that in the head of a sperm was a little person. And since they were a little sexist back then, they referred to it as a little man. And this little man lived in the head of the sperm, and when the sperm landed in the female's uterus, the little man, or really little woman, would pop out of the head of the sperm and grow to full size. So it was believed that whether your child was male or female just resided in which sperm landed in the uterus, and that the female had absolutely no role in the conception of the new child. We now know that that is not true. We now know that that sperm has to fertilize an ovum in the female in order to create the new child. But the term homunculus for the little man in the sperm head, that term hasn't died because you have a little man map on your post-central gyrus. It's called your somatosensory homunculus. So on the right-hand side, you can actually see an entire map of you along that entire fold. Now, what is interesting is that it's not proportional if you look at how big the body is in certain areas. If you look at the torso and the upper limb, it's covering a really small area for that huge part of the body. But look at the hands. The hand alone takes up just as much cortex as the rest of the upper limb. And then look at the head, especially the area around the mouth. Huge area of that fold is dedicated to the sensations coming from those areas of the head. Now, the reason for this disproportionate appearance on the little man map is that larger areas on the fold have more sensory receptors. So there are certain areas of your skin that are just more sensitive to stimuli. And the more sensory receptors you have, the more area in the cerebral cortex you need to process all of those sensations. So your little man map is disproportional so that you have all the sensations from your hands and all the sensations from your face adequately processed. Now, you need to ask yourself, if the primary somatosensory cortex gives you the awareness of your somatic senses and the spatial discrimination, what would happen if this area became damaged? What if you had a patient come in and they had a stroke that severely damaged your right primary somatosensory cortex? Well, you would lose your ability to detect sensation through the skin on the left side of the body. So remember, the right side of the brain receives information from the left side of the body. So the skin on that side, you could prick it with a pin and you would not be aware of any pain or touch sensation, because if you're pricking the skin on your left arm and the corresponding area in your primary somatosensory cortex is damaged on that right-hand side, you can't process it. So damage to this cortex is a loss of sensation through the affected area of the skin. Now let's go to your posterior side of the cerebral cortex. We'll talk about your primary visual cortex. The primary visual cortex is the posterior tip of both occipital lobes. So it's the little teeny yellow area, that very posterior tip. Now, this area gives you visual perception. So it's going to make you aware you have seen something. However, the only information that you get is you get what color was it, what is its general shape, and was the object you saw moving or not. So you get color, general shape, and movement. Nothing else. You don't know anything else. You're just aware you've seen something. Now, damage to the primary visual cortex would result in blindness in the affected eye. So you would have visual loss. Have you ever heard that a hit to the back of the head could make you see stars? The reason that you see stars when you have an impact to the back of the head is because you have physically stimulated the primary visual cortex. You have that impact to that area, and it artificially creates a visual stimulus when there really wasn't anything that you were looking at that had that particular, star shape. With regards to primary gustatory, your primary gustatory cortex is located in the anterior part of your insula and also the inferior portion of your postcentral gyrus. Now, this cortex is going to give you perception of taste. So this is the area that makes you aware that you have tasted something either sweet or salty, bitter, sour, or umami. If you've never heard of umami, umami was discovered several decades ago by some Japanese researchers, and this basic taste is actually savory. So that savory flavor that you would get from eating meat, that is umami. So if you damage your primary gustatory cortex, you would develop an inability to taste. So you're going to have an impaired ability to taste. Your primary auditory cortex is located in the superior part of your temporal lobe, near the lateral sulcus, and there is a little bit of primary auditory cortex in the insula as well. Now, this particular functional area is going to give you auditory perception. So auditory perception is awareness that you've heard something. However, all you get are some basic sound characteristics like pitch and rhythm. So there's no interpretation of language, there's no distinguishing between a telephone, ring, a car horn, and the television. Like there's no understanding, but you can discern that you've heard something and its general pitch and rhythm. Now, damage to the primary auditory cortex, since this is the area that allows you to hear, impairment here would be some degree of deafness in the affected ear. For the primary olfactory cortex, which you can't see in this figure because it's deep, it's located in the medial aspect of the temporal lobe. So what you're looking at here is the lateral surface of the temporal lobe. So if you went all the way into the medial surface of the temporal lobe and also some of the inferior frontal lobe. Now, the primary olfactory cortex gives you olfactory perception. So you gain a conscious awareness of odor. Now, if you have damage to this cortex, since this is the area that says, I have smelled something, if you damage it, you're going to have anosmia, which is an inability to detect odor. Now, when you think of motor areas, remember motor areas give you voluntary control, so they're going to control skeletal muscle. You only have one true motor area in the cerebral cortex, and that is your primary motor area. The primary motor area is located in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. Now, the precentral gyrus is the fold that is anterior to the central sulcus. So it's the entire dark blue fold on the image in front of you. Now, its function is to give voluntary skeletal muscle control. So every single skeletal muscle can be consciously triggered to contract using commands coming out of this fold. The reason that this area has the ability to control all of those skeletal muscles is that this fold has a motor homunculus. It has a little map of you across the entire fold. And if you look at the body laid out on this fold, just like the somatosensory homunculus, it's not proportional. The areas controlling the hands, the face, and the tongue take up the majority of the fold, leaving the upper limb, torso, and lower limb in a very small percentage. Now, the reason that you have this disproportionality comes down to what you're actually controlling. In this homunculus, the size of the area controlling a body part corresponds to the number of muscles in that body part and the number of motor units within that muscle, within those muscles that need to be controlled. And in the hand and in the face and in the especially in the tongue and lips, the muscles here are smaller, but they are more numerous. And within these muscles, you have numerous numbers of very small motor units. And remember, small motor units, it's one neuron to maybe 6 muscle fibers. And that the benefit of the small motor unit is precision control of movement. And if you think about your hands and what they have to do, they're involved in a lot of really precise movements for things like text messaging, tying your shoes, playing the piano, writing. If you think about the lips, the tongue, and the cheeks, and all the delicate movements they have to make just to make your letter sounds as you talk, it's very, very precise movement that's required. So these areas on the map have more motor units, meaning more motor neurons are needed to coordinate that movement. If you think about the rest of the body, the upper limb, the torso, the lower limb, these areas, the motor units tend to be a little bit larger because the movements here just need to be powerful, not as precise. And if you have larger motor units, it doesn't require as many neurons to control those muscles, and those areas of the map tend to be a little bit smaller. Now, what is interesting is if you damage an area on this fold, the resulting deficit is paralysis in that body area. So if you damaged the hand region in the left primary motor area, you would have paralysis in the right hand. You would not be able to move the right hand. Because remember, the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. And if the area on the map designed for hand control is damaged, the other areas of that fold can't fill in. The other areas in that fold are designed to control the other muscles of the body. So if you have a patient come in and the left side of their face is paralyzed, you know that it is specifically the right primary motor area, and based on this homunculus, you can predict where on that fold that the damage actually did occur. So it is a way to narrow down exactly where your damage was if a patient comes in with a stroke before you even have an MRI or a CT.